Great. Well, let's just start. Do you feel comfortable starting?
Yeah, I'm gonna turn my volume up so I can hear you.
Yeah, good.
Okay.
Great. So welcome everybody to our Unscripted, where women's power talks interviews. And I am talking today with Nastashia Minto, poet and activist living in Portland, Oregon. Hello and welcome, Nastashia.
Hi, thank you for having me, Eva. Thank you.
Totally. I'm really excited. We talked a little bit already about some of the things that are important to you and what you hope to achieve with your activism, your poetry. Why don't you share a little bit about that as we start off today?
Yeah. So I have a collection of poetry titled Naked. And it's out. You can get it from Eldritch Books is my publisher. So if you want to support me, or Amazon or any of those places. But my poetry, as I was talking to my mentors last week, it talks about the things that we shy away from talking about. And that's what my heart and my passion is, because I grew up with my grandparents, and with them we didn't talk about a lot of things. Like, we didn't talk about my grandmother living on a plantation, and we didn't talk about my grandfather working in a plantation either. We just never talked about things. And so as I got older, I was always the one asking why. So why don't we talk about it? Why can't we know more about it? And what's so bad about it that we can't hear it, which it was bad.
Yeah.
And so when I started writing and just going out and doing the work, my activism, as I call it, I wanted to ask those questions that no one wanted to ask. And I wanted to be able to sit with people and allow them to really talk about them things and not feel shame or, like, oh, you're going to judge me, or just sitting with their emotions as well. And so that's, I don't know, that's where a lot of my work come from, is me wanting to know more, but also just wanting to talk about things that most people don't want to talk about. So
And when you talk about it, it's not even just talking about it, but holding the space so others can talk about it. So it's being that conduit for conversations that don't typically happen.
right.
So how's that going? So you're putting yourself out there, you're sitting, you're entering into really vulnerable space a lot of times with people. What's that like, and what are you learning?
So it's really interesting. It depends on who I'm talking to and how much they want to open up and share. And I'm always tell people, you go as far as you want to go out. I don't push. I'm not a pusher at all. And I think I'm not that way because of people who have pushed me. And instead of pushing me to open up, it just made me close down more. And so what I've learned from people is that if the conversation is fluid and you're open and they're open and you're just sharing, and that level of trust, they're like, okay, maybe we can go a little bit deeper. Just keep going and keep going. And some people are like, nope, that's all I want to share with you. And so what I've learned from having these conversations, either with adults or children, because I'm a student success advocate right now, and so I've learned that if you just give people that permission to be vulnerable, to be open, like I told one of my students last week, is that I understand I'm not a therapist and I do not have the answers for them, but I'm here to sit with them and listen to them. And that was all. She was like, that is all I need. Like, I'm not looking for answers or any of that. I just want somebody to hear me out. And being heard is what a lot of people want. That's it. Just like, hear me. Stop trying to fix me. Stop trying to save me. Stop trying to have a solution. And that's the one thing we talk about in our job, is a yes and. And the yes and is, okay, yes and, but you're not trying to give a solution. You're not trying to fix the person. And those are the beautiful things that I've just witnessed in having these deep conversations, especially with a lot of Black and brown people just recently. Is like, what do we even do? How do we even feel? Because we're so overwhelmed. Like, where do these emotions go? How do I even write when I can't even get my brain to stop feeling rattled? And so, yeah, these conversations have been big, and that's what my partner is telling me. It's just like, make sure you're taking care of yourself. Just like hold that space, but make sure you're going back out to nature and really doing what I need to do to reground myself. So,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You know, I really liked what you said about sitting in that space and sort of inviting people, not pushing, but inviting. And even as you were talking, I started getting this sense of this energy flow that happens. And this actually happens in good therapy too, right? Where there starts to be a dance of energetic. And the thing is, when we sit and meet somebody where they are, that's profound, because which one of us in our lives really gets met consistently? And
mhm,
for some people, at all, right? Because we're all so fast, we all have a lot on our minds. To stop and be present and to be centered, um, and to just meet somebody where they are. It's like energy meeting energy. And when it's resonant and when it works, there's a flow back and forth, right? And I think it's some of that discharges some of the pain and the suffering, and because it can flow. If your energy is off from somebody else, if you're up here and they're down here, like, you can't connect and then create that, seems, you know what I mean, that flow.
yeah,
So I really appreciate what you're saying.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So you asked a question of me that I want to turn around and ask of you in our last conversation, because you are doing that work of sitting and being a conduit, right,
Hmm.
for other people's pain and suffering, the things that they don't always want to share, though
Right.
they're willing to share with you. But that's being in the flow of a lot of heavy stuff. And your partner saying, hey, you better, how you recharge and how you take care of you. But talk about that experience of sitting with some of this pain. And especially we're talking about your grandparents being on the plantation. And I mean, this is a kind of a profound loss, right? And a profound suffering that there are not a whole bunch of experiences that to get to that level, right? So that's deep. How have you been able to sit with that? And is there a place that you want to channel some of that knowledge, experience, whatever, into the work that you're doing?
Yeah, thank you for re-asking the question I asked you.
Yeah.
Um, well, to start off, I had to be really honest with myself. And me being honest with myself meant that I needed to have therapy. I needed to start therapy. And so last year, 2019, was the first time I had ever seen a therapist. And she's still my therapist now. She's wonderful. Um, but it was that where I was like, I don't know how to hold this anymore. And I was, as I told her, I was disassociating so much that I would forget how I looked. And that's when I knew, I was like, something's not right.
Yeah.
Like, I could look in the mirror and 5 minutes later, I would just totally forget how I looked, what I had on. It was just the mundane of going through a day, a routine. I just felt so numb. And trying to explain that to people, and they're like, everybody else in the world wants to feel. And I was just like, I was blocking everything out. I was like, I am too much energy coming in. I hear everything. I feel everything.
Mm-hmm.
I just need to step outside of my body. But the thing is, I didn't have the tools of how to get back inside my body. And so when I started therapy last year, that was stuff that we worked on, was talking about my past, but really digging into it and understanding how I was like relating those things as of that day, that year. Like, how is that stuff affecting you like right now? Not like,
Mm-hmm.
not then, but like, right now. And then I would just say to her, like, my answer for the longest, and it's so funny when we go back and we talk about when I first started therapy to now, it was always like, well, I don't know. I don't know. And she's like, okay, well, let's think on it, or like here's a prompt that you can write about. And so and I was still working with people. I was still working in the traumatic brain injury. I was still doing my poetry, but I was also like, once I did it, that was it. I didn't have anything else to give. And so I said to her, I was like, I don't want to be like that. I don't want to be shut off from the world. I want to feel, but I want to be able to say, these are your feelings. Or as my friends say, like, this is your coat. You can take it off. We can put it in the closet. I don't have to put it on. I don't have to wear it, but know that it's here and we can sit with it. And I said, I want to be able to do that. And I want to not take everything with me and take it to sleep or take it to the next day. I want to just be able to say, like, okay, it's here. And we can sit with that. And so last year was a big starting point of me just trying to figure out how to hold everything that I know I was capable of holding without like burning myself out. And that's what I started doing. I started saying, okay, that's not mine. That is theirs. But I can sit with them. And if I don't have space, I tell people, like, right now I don't have space. I've had to say it so much because of school and everything I'm starting now. I'm like, I don't have the capacity to hold it. I don't have the bandwidth. And when I do stuff, I want to do it to my best abilities. Or when I'm sitting with my students, I'll tell them, I want to be able to truly sit with you. So if you call me at 5:30 in the afternoon to talk about something, I might say, let's talk about it in the morning. So I'm very fresh. But those are ways that I've dealt with it personally and with my students. And with my grandparents, my grandfather, because my grandmother passed away, I always ask him to tell me the story of how he met my grandmother. And it's just something about that story that brings in love, and not just love, but love between two Black people he's from Jamaica and she's from Georgia. But his stories of how they met and how he dreamed of her and how he came to the States. And even though he was working on a sugarcane plantation and she was working out in the cotton fields, like somehow they met. And something about that story that does something to my DNA that I'm like, they went through everything they went through and they still ended up together. And they lasted for 40-something years, 47 years. And that's the story that I want to talk about. And so every time I call him, it's so funny because I called him and he'll say, Gal, you ask this story every single time. You want to know something else? I'm like, you can tell me whatever you want to tell me. So yeah, that's really how I recharge myself, is those few things of saying that, one, this is not mine, but I really love nature. And so last week when I was talking to you, I was out just in New Mexico, shoes off, toes in the dirt, like digging into it. I'm all about nature and sitting with nature. I love trees. I truly think like my heart is connected to the roots and we just beat and speak the same language. And my element is water. And so I really try to find those things and make sure I'm always like going back. And I always hear my grandmother saying, like, create something. Whatever it is, create something. Make a meal, create something. And so, yeah, I feel like I just gave you a winded answer, but oh man, those are the things that I do.
Well, it's really interesting to me. You're like, I asked my grandfather the same thing. And it almost seems to me, Nastashia, that there is a connection to love, right? Mm-hmm. And true strength, which is often about endurance. Mm-hmm. And I also think that there is a character there, a defining character of who your grandparents were, are, and how that was handed to you. Mm-hmm. And there is power in that, right? There is strength in that. There is orientation in that, right? Because, we talk about dissociation, it's really about a loss or a disconnect from the self. Mm-hmm. And that's a powerful reconnection, not only to the self in the moment, but the self historically. You know what I'm saying?
Mhm,
Does
mhm.
that resonate?
Yeah, it does. It does. I was just sitting with that and thinking about that and how the power and endurance, because my grandfather, he's 84, and he was diagnosed with COVID back in June.
Mm.
And they had this moment where everybody was like, we don't know if he's gonna make it, and he was on a ventilator and all this stuff. And I just kept like praying and calling out to my grandmother. I was like, if this is his time, then please be with him as he go. But I was like, that man is so stubborn and like strong will like me that
Yeah.
he's gonna be like waking up wanting chicken nuggets or something. And that's it's funny, but like that's exactly what happened. He went in June, finally got off the ventilator mid-July, and he started like recovering. And the moment he had like his feet into out, he was just like, I want some chicken nuggets. I'm like, Granddaddy, you can't have chicken nuggets. But I think about that and just how resilient he is and how he went back into the hospital with double pneumonia in August, and they're just like, we don't know how this man is doing whatever he's doing, how he's holding on to say. And I just look at him and I'm like, there's so much strength. And he's so gentle. That's where my mom say I get it from. She's like, you're pretty much like your grandfather. You're very gentle, but also very strong and humbled. And so she gave me all like the characteristics of him. And my sister is very much my grandmother. She's very feisty and like outspoken. And so I watch him and I think like this is love.
Yeah.
This is love. You're right. And this is the resilience of it. And this is what my DNA and my cells wanted to know. This is why I went on a month-long pilgrimage to figure out like who am I and where do I come from? And so you are right. You're very right. It's that story of love that we don't often hear and how we connect on so many different levels, more than just like, oh, we're cousins or this is my aunt, but no, this is very cellular. This is deep.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's deep.
Hmm.
It's deep. Well, it's interesting because the work that I'm doing, I'm preparing to teach a course, the Via De Nova, which is all about um, sharing with women the fundamental elements of living with personal power and authenticity. And so much of that emerges from having this very transparent and aligned, accurate relationship with ourselves, who we are, right? Because when we can clearly stand on our own truth of who we are and then take actions from that place, right? We can then begin to project that into the world in a very strong, clear way. And
Mm.
that work, right? That fundamental foundational work of getting clear is so important, right?
So important. Yes. Yes. I agree. I was thinking as you were speaking how it's resonating so deeply with me because sometimes we say to people, well, you just need to know who you are. But that's not as easily done, and as it's said. And so as you were saying it, and I was thinking about the women that you're going to be working with, is that first step of just acknowledging, I don't know who I am, but I'm very open to knowing who this person is and knowing the things that I like and knowing the things that I don't like and the things that I will put up with are things that I absolutely won't put up with, and the things that trigger me and why they trigger me and how am I going to work through that. And so I was just, all these things started coming in my mind as you were speaking, but then I was like, no, I want to just sit and listen to what you're saying. And so I feel like this is going to be very beautiful and opening up so many channels. And that's what I try to tell people, is that just because physically you're not out doing something, the moment you start to open up and say, this is who I think I am, or this is who I'm becoming, or I'm not sure. Just know that your body may just feel really tired and it's going to take some work. And some days you might be like, why do I feel so tired? Because you said no. And that was the first time you've ever said no. And standing in your power. And so, yeah, I'm excited to see how your course goes. And
Yeah, me too.
like,
Me
I'm
too,
just
because the
excited.
first
I'm like,
the first cohort is not till January. So right now, as I'm putting the refinements on the last pieces of it and uploading it to the educational platform, and I can just dream, right? I'm just dreaming, and I'm seeing all these faces and the excited and deep conversation, and because the course is a 3-month immersion course, it's delivered online, but with a lot of engagement with me and the other students, and it really is a 3 months of standing in front of who one is, right? The whole first 6 months is all about, crafting the mechanism of personal power. And it starts with, who am I and how do I begin to discover what are the tools that I can use, right, to answer that question? Because, and you mentioned this already, so much is out there, just be authentic or da-da, but nobody's telling anybody how to do it, right? Nobody's been giving that information. We're like, all right, do this, do that. All right, good. But now how do I do that, right? So there's a fundamental disconnect. People have the prescription, but not the path.
right.
And that's not everybody. What's that?
Oh, I said, that's good. You should write that down. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's what I'm saying. So the first 6 weeks is all about, how do I turn on again, activate the channels of information that I need to understand who I am in the world, right? And how do I learn to take action once I have that data in such a way, not only that I meet with success, whatever I define that to be, but that I'm constantly growing my joy, my peace, my confidence, my purpose, my meaning, my vitality, da 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 da. That's right action, right? So the first 6 weeks is all about that. And then it's about, now I have this clarity around who I am, and I'm taking it out into a world that's not so interested all the time in what I have to say, right? How do I navigate that space? And that's the second half of the course. And then how do I dream the highest form of who I am in the world and put that out safely and successfully? That's the 3 months. But whoever steps into that, 3 months of like focusing on yourself, it's intense, right? So I imagine people are going to be tired, right? So when I hear you saying that, just saying no for the first time, right? That is exhausting.
It is, especially when our society, or I'll make it even smaller, when maybe even the people that's in their world have never seen that from them. And so then you have this new person, new action that you're putting into the world that is so confusing to the people around you. And then they'll say you're changing. And you're like, well, of course I am. Of course,
That's the
right?
point.
Of course. But to them, that change, because it may, and I say it may seem so drastic when you know that you've been working all this time, and they're like, but you just changed overnight. And you're like, no, I've been working on myself. And then you would hope that the people in that realm would either say, okay, I'm going to accept you as you're changing and work through that, or they might just be like, this is too much for me. I don't really like this whole thing of what you're doing. And just hearing you say that, I'm like, man, that is something that I walk through, is that change. And we talked about the unknown last week.
Mm-hmm.
And as you were saying that, I was like, yeah, oh yeah, that's being in the unknown, because you just don't know. You don't know your power until you're like stepping and walking in it. And people say, well, you're just so powerful. And people will tell you that. But if you don't feel it and you don't see it, then you can't acknowledge that to yourself. You can't hold that, because you're like, well, I'm trying, thank you, But just that
Right.
unknown is it is so beautiful and so strange, but that's not the word I'm looking for. To me, stepping into the unknown was just like, I have no idea what I'm about to get into, but I know I need to get into it.
So now you're not just talking about getting into the known, but getting into your courage,
Yeah.
right? So talk about that for a minute, because making change requires a willingness to step into uncertainty and not knowing where the ground is or the directional, because it just changed on you. And it requires something of courage. And from what I'm hearing, Nastashia, you've been in a serious path of becoming and getting back to who you are. So talk about courage and how that shows up for you, and more importantly, the things in your life that support your courage.
Courage. I would say my first bold action and the courage I took to step out of something was when I was 25. And I just told this story recently, so hopefully I don't tear up because it's just coming out of me. But when I was 25, I remember saying to myself that I never wanted to be as poor as I was. I never wanted to be homeless again. I didn't understand how I had a degree, working on a second one, and still could not find a job that was making more than like $10. And so I just said, okay, universe. Or at that point, it was God, because I was a heavily devoted Christian. I did youth ministry. I went and spoke at multiple churches. So I thought that was my path. I was always told I was going to be a preacher, and I just held on to it like, I'm going to be a preacher. But at the same time, I was battling with, but I like women. And I knew it since I was 9 years old. And I just never said anything about it because both of my grandparents were ministers. So then we had that. And at 25, I said all that, and I said, God, I can't continue to live in like this really deep depression and anxiety around who I am as being gay. So if you don't love me, but you created me, then just take me now. I was like, I don't care how you take me out of this world. It could be a heart attack. It could just snap the breath out of me. Whatever you need to do, because I can't continue to walk in this world or whatever this is and not being who I feel like I am. And so many people ask me, like, did you really say that? And I was like, yeah, I was so serious. I thought at that, I was just crying at that moment, because I was like, if I die right now, at least I would die knowing that I was being so true of like, God, if this is what you want, then I'm here and you can take me now. And I remember sitting there, and when I said those words, it was like clarity and peace, and I'm getting chills now, but it was just like all of that came over me of like, no, you are exactly who I made you to be. And I just felt empty, like not empty as in there's nothing in me, but my brain felt like it could hold more. It felt like it wasn't stacked on top of what the Bible said, what my family said, what society said, none of that. It was just like, okay, now you have a clean slate. What are you going to take into this body? What are you going to allow in? What are you going to give out? And then I was like, well, who am I? And what do I look like in this world? And that courage, what you're speaking of, like, do I even have the courage to tell myself that I love myself? Do I have that courage to say in the mirror that you are beautiful? And you're beautiful now as who you are, but also who you are becoming, and loving every part of that. And that was just like the steps for me. And so I try to tell people when they're like, you're just so confident and you're just so bold in what you do. And I'm like, but it took those moments for me to even say that I loved myself. And even in moments when I didn't believe it, in moments when I didn't believe that I was beautiful, in moments when I didn't believe that I was enough, it took those moments to keep saying, like, you are enough. You are enough. You are beautiful. You are worthy. Just me hugging on me and loving on me.
Mm-hmm.
That to me was big courage, because I wasn't taught that. I wasn't taught that.
If I could ask you something, and this is kind of like, you have to kind of find your way through this maybe to what is true. Because, okay, so what I heard you say is there was this moment of, and now this is me paraphrasing, there was a moment where you were met by God. Okay, so now that's going to make me like, you were talking earlier about how you like to sit with people, right? And in that stillness and in that openness, meet them where they are. And I was saying, oh yeah, because then you guys can resonate, and then the thing can flow. You can receive them authentically, they can receive you, and there's a real meeting, and there's a real validation. I see you. And as you were talking about the spiritual experience, I was like, oh my God, you had that thing with God. You were like, I am here, talk to me, this is my question. And the way you phrase that, it sounds like you were met in that deepest place that you opened to, and in meeting and being seen and validated was the beginning of self-validation.
Right.
It's being seen and affirmed at the most fundamental level. And it became like the first brick, this is what I heard, the first brick in your ability to build your foundation, right?
Right.
Yeah. And so, like, going back to psychology, right? When there is adequate parenting, that is what parents give their children, that very primal sense of being seen and validated, loved, affirmed for who they are. Boom, done. Right? That brick, they put in the first brick. And from that first brick, you can build a life that has that in it, right? And for those of us who may not have got that first brick, right, it becomes very difficult to build, right? And we could go into the psychology, but you actually do need some, and I know you want to study psychology, so I'm going to just say a little bit of this. The access to disorders, all the personality disorders, one of the fundamental pieces of them is this hollowness of character, right? The narcissisms, the borderlines. There is a missing brick, that fundamental brick off of which one can build. But what I heard you say is, like, I reached out to God and I received the platform off which I could build, right? And it's that in being seen and being validated, which is the very thing, whether it's conscious or not, it sounds like you are returning and giving to others. It's so, like, profound.
Yeah. I thank you for saying all that, especially about psychology, because I have my bachelor's and then an associate's in occupational therapy, and then now going back for depth psychology.
Right.
And
That's right.
just like when I think about that and the building blocks and the foundation of it, I always think about, you just, like, I love that analogy, and now I'm just holding on to it, about the brick laying the first foundation, and how many people I know that foundation has not been laid, will not be laid, will never be laid.
Yeah.
But yet we still crave that. And I throw myself into that because it was just this year. And although COVID has done some intense thing and people have done some intense things, being isolated by myself for 3 months made me really have to sit with my loneliness and my abandonment.
Yeah.
And where were those like blocks? And even if I was calling out to my mother, I'm still in contact with her and we talk a lot, but it's just like she does not have that capacity to mother me. And it was this year that I finally said, I'm 30 years old, and I'm like, why am I still holding on to this idea of what I want her to be? Why am I still holding on to this expectation? And people are like, no, but she should be a mother and she should be. I'm like, she just cannot. She cannot mother me. And because addiction is a disease, it was me understanding that she too is battling not only with this disease, but her past too. And no one ever held her little, and no one ever put that foundation in her. So now she is almost 50 something, and she's just like, well, I'm trying to figure out who I am. And so when you were saying that, I was just like, oh, neuroplasticity.
Oh yeah, it's real. It's real.
So that's like, it's like neuroplasticity. Okay, all right.
Yeah, you're good. You're good. It's real.
How are we going to make new connections? How are we going to allow ourselves? Because that is a big part of it too, is when you're walking either in your passion or towards is that you have to allow yourself to do certain things. No one ever tells you that. You're just like, oh, I'm just going to do it. But the thing is that if we don't allow ourselves to be open or allow ourselves to be vulnerable, then we will still be in that same old person, thinking that we're operating in a new person. And that was something big that I learned, is that I had to allow myself to be vulnerable, allow myself to be loved. And that's what I love about my partnership now, is that it's a big thing that I'm learning. And I told her, I was just like, I am so used to doing things by myself that I have to allow you to do things for me. And so I was like, if I say no the first 17 times, please don't be upset. Just like, I'm working through this stuff. I'm really trying. But I wasn't raised in a family like that. And because I've had to do stuff by myself all the time, I'm just like, no, I got it. I can do it. I can do it. You allow someone to do something for you genuinely, and you feel it, it scares the SHIT out of you, excuse me. But it's just like, it's so scary to, one, be vulnerable, too, and say, okay, you can do that. Or, okay, I'm trying to open myself up so that I can even receive this love that you're giving me. Like when you're in the process of learning how to love yourself, and then someone else is trying to love you, and their love is so big, and you're like, this is way too much. And then just walking in that. And so when I think about the courage that we started talking about with, and then my spiritual experience of just sitting with God. And I tell people now, I'm like, I have that so much because I'm like, I'm sitting with nature. I'm sitting with my ancestors. Like, now I'll allow myself to have those experiences. And I allow the universe to just work in me. I feel like we are supposed to be in this together. Every element of this earth that we're on is in me. And so I'm like, we're supposed to be doing this together. At least that's how I feel. And I know it has a big part of our passion, walking in our passion.
Yeah. I want to explore the passion piece a little bit, but I'm just really being pulled back to say something about the neuroplasticity. And the thing is, which I think is also so profound, that your path of meeting others is building the neuroplasticity of connection and resonance with, and that foundation that we were talking about, because it can build from someone giving it to you, but it can also build from you giving it to someone else. So it's just really interesting. And you talk about, nature and God in you moving, and we heal together. People heal together. You can't do that kind of healing on your own. And it's just intuitively, you have found a path of continued healing, this very foundational stuff in your service. I wouldn't call it service, your service to others, right? So I think talk about just organic movement toward what is healthy, and how nature and life conspires to give us what we need if we are open to it and take it, boom, right there. So I do want to pivot for a second and talk about, because you're writing, there's a big passion of yours, and it's also a means to express and explore some of the things you're talking about. Tell me a little bit more about that. Like, how are you finding that?
How I'm finding that. So writing itself has always been a way that I've expressed myself. Um, Once I learned how not to talk so much and yell back at the teachers and get in trouble, one of my teachers said, "Here's a journal." Like she just like had a journal. It was beautiful and I love colors. She was like, "I just want you to write in it. It doesn't matter what you write, just write it." And I was like, "I'm not writing in this." And I was like, this seventh grader who was getting in trouble all the time, and I just didn't have an outlet. I played sports and everything, but like it was just not enough. I didn't know how to channel everything I was feeling and to get it out in a healthy way. And so she said, "Well, I want you to just start writing." And I'm like, "I don't write. I don't even like literature. I don't like, just going off. I don't like any of this stuff." And she said, "Okay, but I'm gonna still give it to you." And so she gave me a journal. And from that, I just started writing little stories about who I want that young seventh grader to be, stories about who I thought I could be.
Mm-hmm.
And then from stories, I thought I was going to like rap. And so I started writing raps. And from that, it went to poetry. And that's when I was asked to read a poetry for one of my 8th grade classes. And so I was like, "Oh, okay, this is really helping me." And then one of my best friends also wrote poetry. And then it just became our thing of like, "Oh, this is how we're going to get through this life. This is how we're going to make it through." But I never considered myself to be a poet. Even last year when my book was published, it came out and it was like, no, I just write. I don't necessarily think I'm a poet. But last year, so from 7th grade up to last year, my writing came back to that thing when I said earlier about wanting to talk about stuff that people didn't talk about.
Yeah.
And so when I wrote my book and it's titled Naked, I was just like, here I am exposing so much of myself to the world. And I was like, but my hope is that people don't read it and be like, "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry for the things that happened to her," but they read it and say, "Oh man, like something similar happened to me," or "I know somebody that happened to," or "Oh, like we can be sensual beings," or "We can love each other in a very deep way and not be sensual with each other." It's like those concepts that we don't talk about because if you're sensual with me, then we must be in a relationship and we must have. No, it's not that. Like, let's share intimacy.
Yeah.
Way that we were never taught. And so that's what writing for me, it does. It just like, it releases. And as some people say, like vomiting on the page
Mm-hmm.
or bleeding on the page. And for me, I'm like, okay, if I do that, I'm going to clean the vomit up. And if I bleed on the page, I'm going to like write it until I feel the wound is healed. And so when I give it to somebody else, they're going to be like, "I know there was a wound. You can feel the scar of it, but it's not bleeding anymore." And I know that's not everyone's process. And I respect however people do things. But for me, there's so much power in words that I'm always very cautious about how I say things when I say it, and like what I'm saying. And that's why I love my editors, because in my book, if there were words that kind of threw them off and it was just so different from how I was writing, they'll just be like, "Did you mean to say that? Is that what you're trying to say?"
Hmm.
And so, yeah, that's how my writing have just formed me, and taking words and making them into something that I never thought it could be, to be honest. And so now that I have this book out and I'm working on my second book, it's just like, is this really me? Is this, is this who I am, or is this who I'm becoming? What is this?
And maybe not knowing, just living it and discovering it, right?
Mhm.
And it's interesting to me, Nastasia, it's about the healing, even in the arc of the pain. I'm writing about whatever, that there's an important piece. Do you think it's something about hope? Do you
Mhm.
think it's something about transformation? Is that the underlying message, really, regardless of what you're talking about? I mean, I don't know. It's a straight out question, because it's very interesting, because I'm still hearing the preacher, right? I'm still hearing the preacher that there is salvation, right? Which is great, right? And maybe that's the path for you. I don't know, right? It's interesting. I can't wait to go get your book and
It
see,
is it
right?
is interesting. Yeah, it is really interesting.
Yeah.
But that is the arc of at least my stories. And I think that's why a lot of people who have interviewed me just about the book, they always say, in most poetry they read, there's not an arc. And they're like, you have this beginning, middle, end. And I'm like,
Mm.
yeah, but I thought every book, I don't know. I was like, I thought every book had that. And they're like, no, you do this thing where you have the beginning of the story and then you put us right in the pain of it. But then you're on the other side where you're talking about these very ethereal beings and love and hope and passion and sex and sexuality. And then you're saying at the end, thank you for being naked with me. Like, almost you got to sit with yourself and realize that you just expose yourself to. And so for me, it is very much that I'm like, yes, let's go through this transformation together. Let's sit in this chrysalis and gooey stuff
Yeah.
and reform and reshape of who we are. And then when we come out, yes, let's fight against it to make our wings strong. Like that is the message. So I was telling you last week, is my message is always to empower and encourage and inspire individuals to be their best selves. I don't want you to be like me. I want you to be like you. Whatever you are, whatever state you're in,
Mm-hmm.
be that and continue to grow in that. And that's what I like, people who tell me that too, and they're not trying to tell me to be like them, or you should
Yeah.
write like this, or you
Yeah.
should probably change this to that. But they're like, no, just be in you and be so bold in you. Be so authentic in you. And that's my message. And that's what I'm so passionate about. And that's why this program that I'm going into is talking about community liberation, indigenous psych, and eco psychology. And I want to learn from that of how do we build communities of being themselves. Like, you can still be an individual in a community. That's what's beautiful about a community, is that each individual bring their own unique thing
Mm-hmm.
to build that.
Mm-hmm.
How do
Mm-hmm.
we work with the earth? How do we work with everything that we already have and working together mycelium? Like, I just think about all that. I'm like, let's talk to each other. Let's make those connections. Let's go back to the root of indigenous studies and let's learn from the people that were on the land before us. And so,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I
That's
just,
beautiful right there. That is a perfect way to end our conversation, with your vision. That's really beautiful. I've really enjoyed just throwing down and being together, right? It's just what emerges and what's important. There's something in each moment that needs to be said. And thank you for sharing this moment and what you needed to say and what I need to say and what needed to be said together. Thank
thank
you.
you.
Thank you, Nastasia. Thank
Thank
you.
you so much for having me and asking questions. And just flowing back and forth. I mean, I really love that word. So when you said it, I was like always trying to stay in flow.
Yeah.
Just staying in flow.